Daniel Reed thought he had found true love with Sophia Martinez, the woman who promised to stand by him while he served his prison sentence. But when the doors finally opened and Daniel walked free, he discovered Sophia was not the woman he married at all. She was Victor Morales, a man who had been deceiving him for nearly a decade. What happened next turned their story of love and betrayal into one of the most brutal true crimes ever told. In 2011, Daniel Reed's world was reduced to a concrete cell, steel bars, and the crushing silence of regret. He was 33 years old when he began serving his 10-year sentence for armed robbery, a crime born from desperation and recklessness. The first few years passed in a blur of routine. Wake up at dawn to the clanging of doors, stand in line for bland food, work in the prison laundry, and retreat back to his bunk at night with nothing but his thoughts for company. The walls had a way of swallowing time, and Daniel often wondered if anyone even remembered he existed. Loneliness in prison is different from loneliness outside. There are always people around, voices echoing in the halls, but they are not your people. They are strangers bound by mistakes, guarded and hardened by survival. Daniel learned quickly that trust was a dangerous currency inside. So he kept to himself, avoiding fights, staying out of the gangs, and quietly counting the years. Yet as months dragged on, the emptiness inside him grew heavier than the bars on his cell. He longed for connection, for something, anything, that reminded him he was still human. It was in his 4th year when he discovered the prison pen pal program. The flyer was simple, pinned on the bulletin board in the common area. It promised correspondence with people on the outside who wanted to offer support, friendship, or just a listening ear. At first, Daniel dismissed it. Why would anyone want to write to a man locked away, a man branded a criminal? But the thought lingered, gnawing at him as nights stretched longer. One evening, in a burst of restless courage, he filled out the form. He listed his interests, his hopes of rebuilding his life, and mailed it off, not expecting much. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The envelope was soft pink, the handwriting neat and flowing. Inside, the words began with warmth. Hello Daniel, my name is Sophia. I know you don't know me, but I believe everyone deserves kindness and a second chance. That first letter became the spark that lit a fire in the darkest corners of Daniel's soul. Sophia Martinez introduced herself as a 32-year-old woman living in Texas, someone who had always cared about helping people who felt forgotten. She wrote about her job as a nurse, her love for music, and how she believed people could change if they had someone who believed in them. Daniel read her letter again and again, almost memorizing every line. For the first time in years, he felt like someone saw him as more than a number in a prison system. He wrote back quickly, pouring out his thoughts with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. Soon, her letters arrived every week. They grew longer, more personal, filled with encouragement, questions about his past, and promises about the future. He began looking forward to mail call like a child waiting for Christmas. In those letters, Daniel found hope. Sophia spoke of redemption, of building a new life once he was free, and of standing by his side through it all. The more she wrote, the deeper Daniel fell. She became his lifeline, his reason to wake up each morning. For the first time since his arrest, Daniel believed he wasn't alone in the world. The wedding was nothing like the ones Daniel had imagined as a young man, yet to him it felt like the most important moment of his life. It took place in the prison visitation hall, a room more familiar with the sound of guards' boots than the laughter of families. The space was stark and plain, with white walls that seemed to drain the warmth out of the air. Metal chairs were lined up in rows, and a correctional officer stood in the corner, his watchful eyes reminding everyone that love inside these walls was still controlled by rules and restraints. Despite the setting, Daniel's heart pounded with anticipation. He smoothed down his uniform, nervous in a way he had not felt since he was a teenager, waiting for his bride to arrive. When Sophia walked in, Daniel's chest tightened. She wore a modest dress, simple and unadorned, but in his eyes she looked like an angel. Her hair was pulled back, and her smile lit up the dull, lifeless room. He had spent years building an image of her through letters, photographs, and phone calls, but seeing her in person felt like something out of a dream. She wasn't just words on paper anymore. She was real, standing before him, ready to bind her life to his. For a brief moment the prison walls melted away, and all Daniel saw was the woman who had filled his empty nights with hope. The ceremony was short, performed by a chaplain who read the vows with the same tone he used for countless other services. There was no music, no family gathered to celebrate, no reception afterward. Instead, there was only the sound of Daniel and Sophia's voices as they promised to love one another despite the circumstances. Their hands touched briefly, trembling with nerves, and when the final words were spoken, they exchanged rings, cheap, plain bands that symbolized a commitment far greater than their value. The guards allowed them a brief embrace, just long enough for Daniel to breathe in her presence, to feel the warmth of her body pressed against his. That fleeting touch was enough to convince him that his future was secured. For the rest of his sentence, Daniel held on to the memory of that day. He replayed the image of Sophia standing in the visitation hall, smiling at him as though he was worthy of love despite his past mistakes. He often wrote about the ceremony in his journal, reminding himself that there was something waiting for him beyond the gates. Whenever despair threatened to take hold, he imagined the life Sophia had promised: a small house in Texas, steady work, and evenings spent together without bars separating them. Other inmates sometimes teased him, calling the wedding a fantasy or a desperate man's attempt to fill the void. But Daniel never doubted what he had with Sophia. The letters continued to arrive, and with each envelope came words that painted their future in vivid colors. She described the furniture she wanted for their home, the trips they would take, and the children she hoped they might raise one day. She spoke of him not as a criminal, but as a man deserving of love, redemption, and happiness. Though the prison remained cold and unforgiving, Daniel now carried a secret warmth within him. He was no longer just serving time. He was waiting for a life worth living. The wedding, though small and constrained by walls and rules, became the foundation of his hope. To Daniel, it was proof that love could exist even in the darkest of places, and that when the day of freedom finally arrived, he would walk into a world where he was not alone. In 2019, after 8 long years, Daniel finally felt the heavy doors of the prison swing open behind him. The world outside seemed brighter, louder, and faster than he remembered. The air was sharp with the scent of gasoline from the parking lot, mixed with the faint sweetness of spring flowers. He took his first steps as a free man, his heart racing with anticipation. For years he had imagined this exact moment, walking into Sophia's arms, beginning the life they had planned through letters and phone calls. He had played it over in his mind so many times that it felt like a dream finally becoming real. Just beyond the chain link fence, a car was parked. A figure stepped out, waving eagerly. Daniel's stomach fluttered with excitement, his eyes scanning for the familiar face he had memorized from countless photographs. But as the person came closer, confusion replaced his joy. The figure was smiling, the eyes were warm and familiar, yet the features were not what he expected. The woman he thought he knew was not standing before him. Instead, there was someone older, heavier, and unmistakably male. The shock hit him like a punch to the chest. He froze, his breath caught in his throat as the stranger introduced himself with a voice Daniel recognized all too well. It was the same voice that had spoken to him on the phone for years, the same voice that whispered promises of love and devotion. But now, without the veil of altered tones and carefully chosen words, it was clear. Sophia never existed. She was a fabrication, a mask worn by a man named Victor Morales. Victor had been corresponding with Daniel under the false identity of Sophia for nearly a decade. The photographs Daniel received were stolen from social media, belonging to a woman who had no idea her images were being used. The letters were carefully written to tug at his emotions, the voice on the phone altered just enough to pass as feminine. The deception was thorough, crafted with patience and skill. As Victor spoke, trying to explain, Daniel felt his world unravel. Every letter he had clutched to his chest, every dream he had built inside those prison walls, every vow spoken in the visitation hall, it all crumbled in an instant. Humiliation burned through him, mixing with heartbreak and rage. He thought of the inmates who had teased him, of the guards who had smirked at his wedding, and suddenly he realized they might have been right. He had built his hope on a lie. Victor insisted their bond was real, even if it had started with deception. He claimed that the connection between them went beyond appearances, that the love they had shared in words and emotions was genuine. But to Daniel, it felt like the cruelest betrayal imaginable. He had wasted years believing in someone who did not exist, shaping his entire future around a phantom. The anger he felt was not only for Victor but for himself, for being so blind, so desperate, that he had allowed himself to be deceived. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to adjust to his freedom, but the revelation shadowed every step. The streets were filled with noise and life, yet he walked through them hollow, his thoughts consumed by Victor's betrayal. He had been robbed of dignity, of trust, of the one thing that kept him alive during his darkest years. The image of Sophia's smile haunted him, taunting him, until it transformed into Victor's face. Each time he remembered, the anger grew sharper, threatening to spill into something darker. Daniel's release was supposed to be a new beginning, but instead it became the start of a slow and dangerous unraveling. Each day he tried to settle into life outside, but the betrayal clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. He rented a small room above a mechanic's shop, found part-time work hauling supplies, and tried to convince himself that he could simply move on. Yet everywhere he went, the humiliation followed. People on the street didn't know his story, but in his mind they all stared at him, whispering behind their hands, laughing at the fool who had married a lie. At night, the silence of his room pressed down on him, and he replayed the years in prison when he had believed in Sophia's letters. What once gave him comfort now twisted into a cruel joke. Victor didn't disappear. Instead, he reached out constantly, leaving voicemails, sending messages, even showing up at the edge of Daniel's work site. He insisted that what they shared was real, that deception didn't erase the bond they had built. He claimed that he had fallen in love too, that his feelings were genuine even if his identity was not. To Daniel, the words felt like poison. Every message reminded him of the humiliation. Every sight of Victor's face sent waves of anger through him. Daniel tried to ignore it, but his thoughts grew darker with each passing week. Pride was something he had always clung to, even in prison, where weakness could cost a man everything. Now that pride was shattered, he felt stripped bare, exposed, a man who had been duped for nearly a decade. His shame hardened into fury, and that fury began to consume him. He stopped sleeping, his temper flared at the smallest things, and the weight of betrayal made him restless, pacing the floor until dawn. Friends he made on the outside noticed his change, the way his eyes seemed distant and his voice carried an edge. They suggested he let go, start fresh, leave the past where it belonged, but Daniel could not. To him, Victor was not just a liar. He was the thief of his dignity, the destroyer of his hope, the reason he had endured ridicule and heartbreak. Forgiveness was impossible. The more he tried to push the anger aside, the more it demanded to be heard. In early November, Daniel's rage reached a breaking point. He reached out to Victor, pretending to soften, pretending he wanted to talk things through. He suggested meeting at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, away from curious eyes. He told Victor he was ready to listen, that maybe they could find some understanding. Victor agreed, hopeful and eager, convinced that love could still survive even after all the lies. The motel's security cameras captured the two of them entering the room together. Daniel carried nothing but a small bag slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Victor followed close behind, appearing almost nervous yet relieved, as if this meeting might finally bring peace. For the next several hours the door remained shut, and the world outside went on unaware of what was unfolding within. When Daniel finally emerged, the look on his face was cold and distant. He walked quickly to his car, climbed inside, and drove away without looking back. Inside that room, the storm that had been brewing for months had finally erupted. When police entered the motel room the next morning, the air was heavy with silence. The curtains were drawn, the bed sheets torn, and the floor bore the marks of a violent struggle. In the center of it all lay Victor Morales, his body lifeless, his final moments etched into the chaos around him. investigators quickly realized the brutality of the scene. This was not an act of passion carried out in a single strike. It was prolonged, deliberate, the result of fury that had been simmering for years. It told the story of a man who had not just killed, but unleashed every ounce of humiliation and betrayal he had carried since prison. The news spread quickly, and within hours the story had captured headlines across the state. A convict who had married his online lover in prison, only to discover upon release that his wife was a man, had now been accused of carrying out a vicious act of revenge. Reporters swarmed the motel parking lot, flashing cameras and microphones at anyone willing to speak. The details were sensational enough to stir both outrage and morbid fascination. A tale of deception, desperation, and betrayal had ended in blood. Daniel didn't get far. Investigators pieced together the timeline with ease, aided by the motel's surveillance cameras that showed the two men entering the room but only Daniel leaving. Witnesses recalled the car he drove away in, and police tracked him down within 2 days. He was arrested at a gas station just outside of town, sitting in his car with the same blank expression he wore leaving the motel. When asked about Victor, he did not deny what had happened. Instead, he muttered only that Victor had destroyed his life. In court, the trial drew crowds who wanted to hear the twisted details firsthand. Prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece, the prison romance built on lies, the sham wedding, the years of deception, and the explosive end. They painted Daniel as a man consumed by pride, unwilling to accept humiliation, and driven to violence because of it. The defense tried to argue that Daniel had been manipulated, that Victor's lies had pushed him to the edge, but the brutality of the crime outweighed every plea for understanding. The photographs of the motel room alone were enough to silence any sympathy. Spectators gasped as the letters were read aloud, the tender words from Sophia that had once given Daniel hope. They became evidence of the manipulation, but also of the depth of Daniel's obsession. Each letter, each phone call, had built a dream that collapsed the moment the truth was revealed. Jurors sat stone, faced as they listened, unable to ignore the violence of the ending. When the verdict was delivered, Daniel showed no emotion. Guilty of murder, the sentence guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the same place where the story had begun. Reporters described his expression as distant, detached, as though he had already resigned himself to the inevitability of returning to prison walls. The case became more than just a headline. It became a cautionary tale. It was told in newspapers, on talk shows, and in late-night documentaries as a chilling reminder of how deception and desperation can twist into tragedy. What started with letters filled with promises of love ended with a brutal crime that shocked an entire community. Daniel Reed had once believed that Sophia Martinez was his salvation. In truth, the illusion of Sophia became his undoing.